Again, everyone, welcome to this live talking all things about fearful avoidance or disorganized attachment. For this live, I'm going to be talking a lot about how fearful avoidance is distinguished in terms of behavior, relational patterns, the kinds of signs that you would expect to see in a partner. And I might do my best to try and distinguish this from the other attachment styles, especially anxious and also dismissive avoidance, because this is a style that I feel gets a lot of confusion, because obviously I used to traditionally think too that there was like secure, anxious, avoidant. However, it's become very clear, particularly as I've done more and more work on this, that disorganized attachment or fearful avoidance is very much its own thing and has a real pattern of behavior that's quite pronounced. So without further ado, I look forward to getting into this with everyone. Just as a reminder, if anyone wants to have any questions, feel free to just throw them into the question box with the question mark, and I will get round to them a little bit later. The first portion of this is really just going to be very much educational, and then afterwards we can do a bit of Q&A. So let's get started. For those of you who may understand avoidant attachment, know that it's characterized by a conscious fear of intimacy and a subconscious fear of abandonment, meaning that a person who gets close to a partner and eventually gets to become more vulnerable, intimate, and also spend more time with someone may get to a point where they're just like, no, this is too much, and then they leave because of their own trauma, triggers, anxiety that cause them to back the hell away from someone, even if it's someone who's actually relatively healthy to be with. We also know that for anxious attachment, it's the reverse, that's a conscious fear of abandonment with a subconscious fear of intimacy, that for many anxious attachers, they obviously try their best to salvage or save whatever relationship that they're in, to do the best they can to try and keep people together that they're dating. And they also have a need to control and also make sure that they are getting reassurance for the love that they're receiving from their partner. Disorganized attachment or fearful avoidancy is like the best of both of these worlds. Disorganized attachment is characterized by what I would describe as not only a conscious fear of intimacy, but also a conscious fear of abandonment. And it's characterized, I would argue, by one defining feature that's very different compared with dismissive avoidance and anxious attachers, and that is mistrust. I find people who are fearful avoidance or have a disorganized attachment, and for the course of this video, I'll just say FA for now as an abbreviation. I find that people with an FA style have a lot of mistrust towards people as they get closer to them. I find that they often start out looking quite like anxious attachers, but then over time, it becomes very clear that there's another side to the story, and there's that real sense of fear of intimacy, which is also combined with a real sense of mistrust and not wanting to be hurt. So traditionally, when someone is being raised under a healthy, secure environment, parents provide their children with a sense of reassurance, emotional support, and also make them feel safe in a loving, healthy environment. The disorganized attachment is like the complete opposite. Growing up with an FA style means you've usually grown up in a very chaotic environment where you probably had caregivers who were incredibly inconsistent. They may have made promises to stick by your side and then never actually shown up. And this may have come around to the point where after consistently making promises, these parents just failed in their capacity to meet any of these promises they set to their children. And these children eventually got to a point where they were just like, I can't be bothered, or this hurts too much to keep trusting someone who's just going to constantly betray me. And they may have had parents who've walked out on their lives, and they've also been made to feel like somehow it's their fault, that they are not worthy enough for their parents' love. And so they've really internalized a lot of the absence of their parents in their lives, and they're made to feel like they have a really low sense of self and also feel quite lonely in the world. Many disorganized or FA-styled individuals are very prone to bouncing from relationship to relationship, getting close, then backing away because they feel like there's a sense of betrayal impending. And so This style is often seen alongside other things, including borderline personality disorder, and is also usually seen in the children of alcoholics and addicts. So it's not uncommon for children who have come from these kind of backgrounds to have a really, really dysregulated emotional system where they have real trouble being able to maintain long-lasting relationships. And funnily enough, these people can be really interesting in terms of just the way they show up. They can be really bright, bubbly, effervescent, and particularly entertaining to be around. These individuals aren't the same in the sense that, unlike dismissive avoidance, who, yeah, some dismissive avoidance can definitely be the life of the party, these individuals, I would say, are much more all over the shop in terms of the things that they like to do, the way they show up, and they tend to be less cold, charming. They're more engaging, entertaining, hilarious. So there's some of like the broad general strokes. In terms of like dating and relationships, unlike a dismissive avoidant, well, actually, I'll start with like a dismissive avoidant. FA-styled individuals usually are very heavy in terms of the love bombing phase as well too, tend to be very big romantics, wanting love. However, usually I find one huge difference between DAs and FAs is that the FAs tend to be far more open to sharing their past. And they'll do so in a way where it comes across as a bit trauma dumpy, where they'll just go and then just sort of like want to use this as a way of trying to connect with someone. And in doing this, this can also be a budding way for them to try and build reassurance and connection with the people that they're starting to get to know. As this goes on, it may get to a point where for the FA-styled individual, they start to become quite interested in this person that they're seeing, and they may start behaving very inconsistently, where they may start seeking reassurance like an anxious attacher would, and wanting closeness, wanting connection, maybe even starting fights, being like, this is toxic, I don't even know if you like me or not, you always behave this particular way, I can't even feel safe with you around, this is so unfair, blah, blah, blah. And this is done in an attempt to try and get their partner to not only get closer to them, but it's also done in a way to try and create an environment which might be similar to the environment that they grew up in, which may have been very shouty, chaotic, emotional. So in a way, this is a part of the trauma that plays out. However, once stability sets in and the environment becomes a lot safer for the FA-styled individual, this is when the avoidance side starts to creep in, and this is where the FA-style person might become mean, passive-aggressive. I often find for a lot of people who've dated FA clients that people who've dated FA individuals, that what usually happens, it's almost like clockwork. Like every 14 days or so, these people might just wake up next to their partner and it's like, you know, a switch went off in their brain and they're just like, I don't love my partner anymore, I'm getting out of here. And they just bolt. They're just like, nah, I'm out. And then after decompressing, they'll then often come back to their partner being like, no, that was a mistake. I'm so sorry. I want to be back with you. And I really, really want to be with you. And so they then go through a much quicker cycle of hot and cold behavior that's very different to a dismissive avoidant. I find the dismissive avoidants tend to one and done a lot of the people that they're with, in the sense that for dismissive avoidance, I often find that their style is get to know you, everything's really, really, really good, then everything just ends abruptly and they're out. And it's highly unlikely that they will return if they rebound into a new relationship, or if they do, maybe from about the 5.5 to 6 month mark, that's when you might see them return, but not the case with an FA style person. People with a fearful avoidant attachment have a funny way of always coming back to the picture again and again and again. And so this can also happen over very long periods of time as well too. This style, I often find, is a lot meaner than dismissive avoidance. Like, yes, dismissives can be cold and condescending around emotional matters, but FAs, I find, are much more nitpicky, mean. If they're in a bad mood and start doing the silent treatment of all things, it's often because they're repeating a lot of the behavior that they had growing up when they had their own caregivers. And they've often come from a lot of very narcissistic parents. So they often model that environment around hostility towards emotions, shaming them for expressing their emotions. And a lot of their behavior, unlike the DAs, is done to try and to protect themselves from being hurt, from being rejected, and also through going through that same experience similar to the way that their caregivers treated them when they were younger. I've often heard really interesting stories from FA clients where they've said things to me like, things that will set them off might include they're sitting with their partner and their partner is eating, say, eggs. For the FA, they might look at their partner eating eggs and it takes them back to a time when one of their relatives was experiencing heart-related conditions which ultimately led to their death due to high cholesterol, and it causes them to freak out because they're just like, no, I can't go through that experience of having a close loved one, pass away because of their poor eating choices. Or, and this is another one that can happen, they often can have a lot of shame because they've often had a lot of parents criticize their eating choices, their weight, and so they often project a lot of that onto their partner by being like, when are you going to go exercise? You really should watch what you eat, because they're so damn ashamed based on the way that they were treated growing up. They've often had a lot of body dysmorphic related issues. So a lot of this, I find, is a combination of a lot of parental shaming and experiences they've had growing up, which they then throw on to the people that are closest to them. So that's something I've seen a lot that clients have often told me, is that they're very aware of where this is coming from. And unlike DAs, FA-styled individuals, I find, and this is my experience, so it may not be everyone, are surprisingly very self-aware and very empathic. These individuals, unlike DAs who sometimes can be so disconnected from their emotions, can sometimes be bloody aware of what's actually going on and also know how a lot of this stuff is playing out. Some of them aren't. And this is where often I find FAs often engage in a lot more denial at times if they're on like the extreme other end where they don't want to own up to a lot of this stuff. But I'd argue that unlike DAs who are much better at masking their low self-esteem, FAs are riddled with low self-esteem and low self-worth. So they often really struggle to have a really good sense of identity around a lot of what's going on. And at times, they tend to be very flip-floppy all over the place in terms of their moods, which can look, like I said, a bit like borderline personality disorder, except the fact that it mostly manifests in relational contexts, not so much outside of that, where they may actually be able to maintain work or they're able to maintain other areas of their lives without having those same sort of like despair-ridden experiences that someone with borderline personality disorder might have. The other thing to also bear in mind too, this is something I said in my live yesterday, I find FAs, oddly enough, have a tendency, if they have the knowledge and awareness of this, to use psychotherapeutic lingo or a lot of terms that are normally used in domestic violence related matters to try and protect themselves when they get angry. I find, unlike DAs who more have what I call a freeze and a flight response, meaning they back away once they feel activated into their avoidance, FAs, on the other hand, I find are characterized by more of a flight and fight response. So as they're exiting, they might get really uptight and angry and start saying things like, you're an abuser, you're a narcissist, how dare you do this to me, you're breaking my boundaries, how dare you do this to me, on the way out. And their partner could have none of those traits. They're just being projected because these people have often come from very narcissistic experiences, a lot of domestic violence related cases where, unfortunately, because they don't feel safe with this person who's actually reasonably stable, they often start replaying the drama with their partner because they're so scared and worried of going through the same experience again, like they'd experienced in previous romantic relationships and also from their childhood experiences. So a lot of the time I find FAs may use a lot of this jargon as a way to protect themselves. An example I used in yesterday's live, which is relevant for this one, is I know that one of my clients who has an FA partner, he was explaining to me that one day he was just, having a bad day where a checkout chick was basically just a bit, cold to him and he felt, offended by it and was explaining it to his partner. His FA partner got so triggered and was just like, I think you need to watch your sexist attitudes. I don't like your anger. You need to go and work on that in therapy. Because understandably for her, based on what I understood, she was really concerned that this was the start of a potential, domestic violence related issues or potential hatred against women, which it wasn't. But it was just one of those things where she was extremely hypervigilant to any kind of sign of potential harm. And that behavior ultimately was something that became quite corrosive over the course of the relationship. The point is that a lot of FAs do have a very real need to try and protect themselves from perceived harm. And the way they go about it can mean that they often scar their partners on the way out in ways that are different from DAs, where it can come across as quite verbally gaslighty and also make them seem like they're, some abuser, which they're not. And there is a tendency too that the FAs, if they're going to come back, even if they know that they're in the wrong, if they're particularly egotistical, they may only want to come back when they feel like they're on a moral high ground. These people can tend to be very self-righteous when they're into that fight state because they often don't want to have to take ownership for their stuff. But if they are more on the self-aware side, they can often be like, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm so sorry. I keep doing this over and over again and I'm really, really sorry. Some of these experiences can be so damn harrowing for their partners because they're often just like, I cannot just maintain, my sense of security being with someone like this when they're just constantly going back and forth, doing things including just breaking up with you constantly, leaving the relationship, coming back a few months later. These people are also more prone to jealousy than DAs. I find because that really links in more with their conscious fear of abandonment, there is a tendency for them to want to have more access and ownership to you compared with DAs. So as a consequence, there is a tendency for these individuals to have very, very, aggressive behavior where they still want to have ownership and control over their partner, despite the fact that, they also fear being too close with them too. It's a pretty intense experience. I have also noticed that this is something that I often see more as a style, and this is my experience, so don't take this as gospel, amongst heterosexual women than men. I find that this has been something where I see a lot of this play out amongst straight women, where they often have these very turbulent relationships with a lot of the guys that they're playing out with. And look, this is just, again, my experience, but I also don't entirely agree with the statistic put out by books like Attached, where they say disorganized or FA-styled individuals are about 5% of the population. I'd argue it's way higher than that, because I've definitely worked a lot more with FAs than DAs in terms of this stuff, and I do think FAs are far more frequent in therapy than DAs. And there's some research which suggests that FAs are harder to treat than DAs. I would actually argue I think DAs can be harder to treat than FAs on my experience, just because the nature of someone who's in a free state can be much harder to work through. Again, my experience, not gospel. A lot of the research would suggest that it really depends on the modality, the clinician, the attachment of the clinician as well too, and how they're impacted by their client's behavior and also their moods as well too. So it can vary from person to person. But needless to say, that's something that's just I've made as an observation based on my own experiences too. What I was going to say, though, is a trend that I have noticed, particularly amongst FA-styled individuals, is that they often can, like DAs, engage in long-distance relationships. But unlike DAs, they may, similar to someone with borderline personality disorder, if they're feeling really annoyed or frustrated with a partner, leave the town or country of the person that they were seeing and may return, overseas to the town, city, state, whatever, when they feel ready to return to that partner, when they're feeling more at ease with themselves. This style can be really brutal on people because it often gets to a stage of burnout where for the poor FA and their partner, the FA often feels just so unworthy, so unlovable, that they may actually eventually get to a point where they're just like, I can't do this anymore, and I just feel so shit being with this person. I feel like, I'm not good enough for them, or I feel like they are going to hurt me. And it often ends in a very it often ends in a really tragic way because they often feel like they're never going to, be given the love that they want. They also feel like this person's going to leave them. Often the language I hear of FAs is really contradictory at times because on one hand, these people are saying, get the hell away from me. And at the same time saying things like, don't ever leave me. Please be the one that's going to rescue me. Please be the one that's going to save me. So at times, these individuals can give you very contradictory messages where they often make it seem like they want you to save them. They want you to still hold out for them. They still want you to be there with them and to also make sure that they're going to be rescued by you, unlike their parents who never showed up in their childhood or any of their previous romantic partners for that matter. So often I find that it's very possible too for men who are dating FA women to try and enter into a bit of a savior role where they try and save these FA women by trying to be there for them and to try and help them through a lot of this stuff. However, for a lot of men who enter in this sort of dynamic who aren't aware of what they're getting themselves into and may also have some trauma around needing to have projects and also to take care of others, this can become a very toxic cycle where this can become very trauma bonded very quickly. So generally speaking, it is a very, very different kind of dynamic to the DAs. Yes, there's a lot of overlap in terms of the brutality of the endings of these relationships or situationships, but it's usually less one and done. And I may do a video explaining dismissive avoidancy in greater detail, but if I had to compare dismissive avoidance with fearful avoidance, I'd say dismissive avoidance tend to be much more austere, charming, cavalier, and also debonair in their approach. And they tend to be quite cool in terms of the way they appear, particularly around emotional matters. FAs, on the other hand, not so much. They tend to be much more emotionally turbulent and also are characterized by much more fear-based related stuff. And they also wear their trauma on their sleeve much of the time compared to the DAs. The DAs have more conscious fears of intimacy and subconscious fears of abandonment, meaning that when they're dating their partner, you only really see the fact that they don't really want to open up or talk about their feelings or the fact that they want to get too close. And then they may abruptly end things. And some of the logic behind that will be that they feel like they can't meet your needs, they're not worthy of receiving your love, and they're also worried that you may abandon them, which is why they choose to abandon you first, because they're so worried about being hurt by you. So that's usually how that plays out. But for the FA, usually it starts with a cycle of fear of abandonment, followed by a fear of intimacy, and then it starts again into a fear of abandonment. So these individuals tend to be very flip-floppy in terms not only of their fears, but also in the fact that they tend to never really be alone for long, and they always seem to jump from relationship to relationship much more quickly than a DA would, and also have a tendency to often enter into very toxic relationships, similar to DAs, which mirror a lot of the experiences they had growing up in childhood, and it continues to reaffirm a lot of the evidence that they're just, maybe going to always be in these toxic relationships, that no relationship is safe. So it can be a very toxic mess. Often for both the DA and the FA, if they date someone who is more avoidant than them, that can often become the catalyst that gets them into therapy, and they're like, I never want to go through that experience again, and I want to undo a lot of this stuff for myself too. I also think too, the DAs typically, because of the way the world is, also the fact that we seem to not uphold, but we seem to, what's the word I'm looking for? It'll come to me. Basically, emotional unavailability seems to be more rewarded, and as a consequence, DAs often find themselves in very service-based roles like, say, medical fields, in psychology, in places where they often feel like they can be in a position where they don't have to really express their feelings. They can actually have a sense of armor and control over the environment that they're in. So they tend to actually do quite well in terms of financial matters, not so much relationally. And they often need to be in very emotionally unavailable relationships, and maybe at times in more chaotic ones, but it depends on from person to person. FAs, on the other hand, not so good at, having the same kind of career success that a DA would. usually just because of a lot of their relational stuff and how it gets in the way of them being able to trust and also sustain healthy relationships over time, even amongst friends and colleagues. So that's a difference there in terms of career. I also find too that for DAs, there is a tendency for them to, like I said earlier, to be able to be a bit more consistent in terms of their emotions, where in the sense that when they're dating someone, that real abrupt ending is like, that's it. There's no usual coming back off the back of that, unless they have the self-awareness, or they don't find anyone that they want to date again, or they're not rebounding, or they have had some like epiphany, which is very unusual. Whereas FAs tend to be much more back and forth with the people that they're dating. So that's another thing to think about as well too. I find both DAs and FAs are both likely to rely on drugs, alcohol, and other addictive related things to manage their internal distress, and also to find things to distract themselves. But I think that generally speaking, the FAs are far more likely to find themselves into very frenetic sort of environments like clubs, parties, and also similar environments which replay the events of their childhood, whereas the DAs are more likely to try and find ways to get away from that. Usually a DA's environment would be something more like they'd come from like a boarding school where they were pushed into an environment which they never wanted to go into as kids, whereas the FA is more likely to find themselves in an environment where there's really narcissistic people around them, and also people who are very controlling and also very dysfunctional. So generally there's sort of like the differences there. I could make this much more elaborate, but for the sake of this, I just want to say that, you know, there is a big difference between the way in which these both play out. But I also want to articulate too, as a clinician, I generally find FAs really, really, really great to work with. I mean, I like DAs too. The one thing I do find is that the anxious part of an FA, quite easy to work with. The avoidant part that comes out for FA clients, very tricky to work with, because that's really about helping them to not only get close to people that are around them, but also to get to a point where they can learn to trust and feel safe with people around them. When FAs actually learn to love and actually be with other individuals, and they can actually create a secure relationship, they can be amazing at it. Many people on social media who are dating coaches are actually former FAs, and they're really, really, really good at being able to try and provide advice for people who are also going through this journey too, because they really do have a good understanding of toxic dynamics, their own side of the street, and also how to create a more secure relationship too. So just putting it out there to say that the recovery for these individuals can yield excellent results for them, not only in terms of the relationships that they have, but even in other areas of their lives too, including their profession as well. So it's not doom and gloom for any of these attachment styles. It really does boil down to self-awareness and also willingness to do the work. Some people are probably going to be more, into their avoidancy than others because of their own childhood experiences. But the point really is to say that it's one of those things where it is a case-by-case basis. So with that all out of the way, I am going to take this opportunity now to reply to people who want to do Q&A. Like I said earlier, love it if you can throw your questions into the little question mark box down below, and we'll go over through some of this sort of stuff. And feel free to ask me any questions. It doesn't have to be FA related. And like I said, I may, off the back of this, choose to do some content more regarding DAs or dismissive avoidance. And who knows, maybe you might even get me to talk more about preoccupied anxious attachers as well too. So with all that being said, let's get into the Q&A. So what are the books you recommend to learn about fearful attachment? I actually just finished one recently. I wonder if I've actually got it here. Nope. Basically, it was a book which was called what was it again? I'll remember what it was. It was by an author called Taha Zid, about how to unlearn disorganized attachment. And that was really specific about it in terms of just outlining the qualities and the traits of someone who has a fearful avoidant attachment style, as well as also the steps one can take to try and overcome it. It was a good sort of book in terms of just being able to give like a brief outline over it. Didn't really have a lot of clinical notes, but it was good just to sort of get a gist as to how this sort of plays out and what to expect from this. And it was great too, because it really is helpful for people who are also partnered with FAs, because it really helps you to understand and appreciate it's not personal. It's just a lot of this is designed to help them protect themselves from the threat of potential harm and mistrust that they have between people who get close to them. The other book that I recommend too is Avoidant, How to Love or Leave a Dismissive Partner. Even though that focuses a lot on the dismissive avoidant, there's still some good notes there about fearful avoidance, so I highly recommend it. I don't recommend attached. I know that sounds strange considering everybody just loves talking about attached, but I find that attached is too limited in terms of its approach, and it doesn't really talk about any of the traits of fearful avoidant attaches. So that's why I think if you're going to try and look for books on this, the ones specifically about avoidance, like those two that I recommended, are great. I will come back and in the comments make a very explicit list of the books that I recommend for this, because I've got a few other ones that I would highly recommend too. But for now, because I've just forgotten what the one that I read most, I'll just move on. But yeah, there is some good stuff out there. I'd also recommend too, if you can find them, there's some good journal articles on FAs too, because it really helps you to understand some of the clinical notes that we have as English in the psychotherapy field, and also for psychologists too, because they can really provide a lot of interesting insights into the comorbidities of like addiction, FAs, the way it shows up, how they self-regulate. So highly recommend that as well. Let's see. How does an FA heal and how long is the process? Okay, so this is a person-by-person basis, but generally speaking, the way this would work is if someone has a FA attachment style, they'd want to ideally start working on becoming very self-aware of their patterns and their behavior and also their trauma responses. So it would really start by having them become more mindful of some of the thoughts and the feelings that they have, the core beliefs. I know for a lot of them, they have this constant belief that people are just going to leave them and that they need to leave first before they're ever hurt. That's one example. There's also a much deeper belief that they are unworthy of receiving love and that people will always leave them. Now, to get to some of these core-rooted beliefs, the process involved would be quite thorough. They'd go from having an understanding of some of these thought patterns to then going through the process of somatic therapy, or basically learning emotional regulation skills to work through a lot of the emotional distress. They would also likely need to also be dating, or at least, in a relationship, to also work through some of the stuff that's coming up for them, kind of like exposure therapy, if you would, whilst they're also working on some of this stuff to become increasingly aware of their triggers and how it also impacts them in relationships. The somatic therapy could include... Okay, I just lost the internet for a second there. Somatic therapy could include things like root cause therapy, EMDR, or even one of my favorites is internal family systems therapy, which is basically a technique where you look at the parts of yourself. So in other words, the different protectors, the inner child, all the elements that make you and how you operate in your relationships, and how these parts of you have come out as a consequence of your upbringing, trauma, and how they're trying to protect you in an otherwise, seemingly unsafe environment. That not only grants you a lot of self-awareness, but also allows you to start working through some of those repressed emotions. So, for example, an example might be when they're looking at, say, the part that is their avoidant attachment, is starting to look at how, the avoidant part is trying to protect them from love, is trying to protect them also from potentially being hurt, and also starting to also work through some of the sadness about how you may never have felt that you were loved as a child. So that's one example of that. Now, overall, I got to be honest, this process can take a damn long time. I mean, depending on the fearful avoidant and also what they've been through, this can take, I'd say, anywhere between 3 to 5 years of really rigorous work. So it's very, very, very long and thorough to try and work through this sort of stuff if someone isn't aware of this stuff already. But usually people with a disorganized attachment end up in therapy anyways because of a lot of other things going on in their lives, which usually are a consequence of their childhood upbringing. So a lot of these people are no stranger to therapy. In fact, they're often very good at this sort of stuff. They're usually people who've come out of 12-step recovery programs because they've often, are sometimes alcoholics or addicts. So it's no surprise that these people often readily engage with this because they often do see marked improvements in their lives. But their relational stuff can sometimes be the hardest battles to try and overcome in therapy. So generally speaking, the process can actually take quite a while. Let's see. Have you found a correlation between fearful avoidant attachment and ADHD or BPD or both? And if so, what could be the best therapy or treatment to heal, given that one is a neurocognitive or even genetic development disorder and the other is a personality disorder? Thank you so much. Okay, great question. So I have to be completely honest and say I am not an ADHD expert by any stretch of the imagination. And my understanding of ADHD, I don't want to create any generalizations, but I will just say from what I understand, it is something that, exactly as you put down here, neurocognitive, genetic, and potentially, from what I understand, can also be influenced by traumatic events. So that's the ADHD component. BPD is something that has got a lot of clinical backing for treatment in terms of dialectical behavioral therapy, which is essentially, from the way I've seen it and also the way I've been taught, is journaling on steroids. It's basically like learning how to regulate your emotions, also become very aware of some of the feelings that you have, the triggers, and also learning ways to try and make you feel safe. It is a pretty intense course of treatment for people with BPD, but phenomenal for anyone without it. I often find that dialectical behavioral therapy is one of the best forms of working through emotional dysregulation. So I'd highly recommend it to anyone, even if they don't have BPD. But I definitely would say, to answer this question, yes, my assumption is I think there is a correlation between BPD and ADHD for people with FA. And I'd argue that ADHD is something seen also in DAs as well too. And like I mentioned earlier, with some of the treatment for someone who's got FA, I'd say somatic therapy is a great choice. I don't recommend basic psychology, because if you're just doing, say, CBT or cognitive behavior therapy, where you're just trying to rethink the way you operate in certain situations or environments, that's not really tapping into a lot of the core stuff, the trauma that's also influencing your behavior and is very subconscious. So as a consequence, I'd say you really want to be with clinicians who understand attachment, who understand trauma, who understand how to really do that mind-body work. And the approach that they often say is bottom up. So that's my personal recommendation for that. And there are lots of good, things available for people who have FA attachments. So, FA style. Let's see. What's going on when you hear, "How did I deserve you? How can you love me?" That to me is it's a comment that I think is made out of a lot of despair and also low self-worth. And it's, to the receiver, it can sound quite sad, because essentially a person who's saying this, someone with an FA style, they're basically saying, I don't believe that I'm worthy of receiving you. I don't believe that I'm worthy of, having this love. I also can't believe that you love me. So a lot of that, when you're hearing it, is often a lot of what I would describe as their inner critic is telling them a lot of this stuff, and they may actually be in disbelief that there was someone like you, because they've had a history of being with people who have left them, have made them feel unworthy, or they feel like they don't have trust in people around them. So with that in mind, I'd argue that it's a comment born from a lot of low self-worth and low self-esteem, and it's quite sad for the FA and also for their partner, because they may be like, what are you talking about? Of course you deserve to be with someone like me, or of course I can shower you with love. But saying that doesn't necessarily make it true for the FA. They often internalize it and believe that they aren't worthy of a lot of this stuff. So that's where, if you hear a comment like that, it can actually be a really good indicator into the person's, emotional well-being. And quite frankly, it could be actually a bit of a red flag if you're dating someone who says that. So I don't want to say leave someone if they say that, but it can be sort of the mark of potential low self-esteem that may also be characterized by very hot and cold behavior. My FA wife says she's not physically attracted to me anymore. If I give her own space, she heads towards infidelity. Any chance of saving this marriage, or should I move on with my life? We have 2 kids of young age. I'm really sorry that you're going through this, Oliver. I can't really give advice on what you're going through. Even as a counselor, I can't give advice. It's a really, really tough thing for me to really just, to give you like a pronouncement on this particular experience that you're going through. I don't really know like what other things she might be having, like in terms of comorbidities. Like, does she also have, maybe other things going on besides just her fearful avoidant style? And also, I don't really know, how the dynamic is also played out, like whether there might be signs of potential sex addiction or other things going on too. In terms of any chance of saving this marriage, I mean, I'd say, like, have you been to couples counselling? Is this something that your FA partner is open to doing? In terms of should you move on with your life, I mean, it's hard to say, because on one hand, it'd be easy for me to be like, of course, move on, you'll be so much happier. But I don't know if this is something that can actually be saved, or whether this is something that, you know, you'd want to move on without giving it a proper go. So it's really hard, especially given the fact that you do have 2 kids. I know many people who are co-parenting with avoidant partners. It can be brutal if their partner isn't working more on their stuff. But the point simply is to say that not everyone has the luxury to simply just get up and not be with their partner, who, especially when there's kids. So as a consequence, I'd say, you know, I would probably recommend speaking to a specialist about it, because it is really, really hard to give any sort of conclusive answers in a live like this. What real talk changes justify letting an FA back into your life for another chance after some time apart and many previous second chances? So real talk changes would really be, they would need to be in therapy. They would need to be very aware of how they have contributed to the dynamic that they are with. They would also need to take the time, possibly, to come up with a plan for how they're going to handle this relationship differently, which would be slower, and also taking deliberate steps to also do check-ins with you on a weekly basis to really talk about how their attachment style is influencing their behavior with you. I would also argue that it's also something you have to think about too in terms of your limits, because you don't have to keep letting these people back in if there's no sign of change or real attempt to try and work on this. Real change is not easy, and it's not as simple as, I'm going to be different next time. That's not change. Real change is bloody hard and painful, and often it comes with time, reflection, space, and also getting to a point where you're just like, okay, I can see how I've contributed to what I'm going through, and I need to approach this very differently and take accountability for my behavior and actually work to do it differently so I'm not hurting my partner on an ongoing basis. Many partners of FAs burn out and get to a point where they just leave, which also can re-traumatize the FA, because it proves to them that people will just leave them, despite the fact that they also contributed to the leaving. So it's a pretty awful thing to go through. He abruptly broke up with me because he got triggered by seeing family, and he's been antagonizing me to be friends ever since, breaking all my boundaries and ruining my life. But we're in the same friend group. How do I handle this? Ooh, that's really hard. I mean, again, I can't give advice, but I'm sorry that you're going through this, because that's pretty awful to go through that experience. If you're in the same friendship group and they're also breaking your boundaries, and it's also getting to a point where it's ruining your life, you wouldn't be alone. I've had clients who've gone through this experience too, and it's pretty awful, because it gets to a point where you have to really almost question, is this a friendship group that I can even be a part of anymore? And it may have to make you reflect on whether you need to take sort of next steps with your life in terms of navigating things. It's a pretty awful experience to go through, because, you know, especially if your friends don't get what's going on, they're just like, why can't you just get along? Why can't you just be friends or just act like nothing's happened? It's like, no, we can't do that, because our sense of being together has been ruptured by this person's behavior, my behavior, if it was relevant. So it's one of those things where, generally speaking, if I'm being really pragmatic about it, it means that you may have to be very mindful of, like, whether or not this is actually a friendship group that you can still entertain being with, because of the influence of your former partner and how he's also now taken almost co-ownership of this space, which is pretty hard to go through. I've had a lot of clients who've gone through this, and it's awful. And some of them do choose to stick it out with their friendship group and try and make it work. Others get to a point where they're like, I can't do this, I need to leave, even if there are some good people that they'd like to stay with. I'm on a break with a fearful avoidant. They are upset. Does this make them more likely to cheat if given the shot? I think that someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style, you know, because usually they can be very impulsive, may cheat in order to feel better about themselves given the circumstance and still come back to you, because the physical side of things will just be there to help them feel better about themselves. It may not necessarily mean that they'll move on with someone else. And also, if they do get back to you, there's no guarantee that they won't cheat if they feel threatened by closeness and also mistrust. So the break itself doesn't really have much of an influence in terms of guaranteeing whether or won't they cheat. It really depends on how that person manages their own distress with being away from you, or if they get too close to you again. How tied into avoidance is people-pleasing and perfectionism? I'd argue very high, but more so on the DA side of things. I'd argue a lot of dismissive avoidants are very big impression managers and also bloody perfectionists to a fault. They are so rigid about wanting things to be done in a particular way that it can kind of feed into the narrative of why they break up with people, because they'll often have this belief of like, well, if I can't do this for you, therefore it's not going to work out. If I don't want to have kids, then this is going to be a waste of time because I'm going to be a terrible dad or a terrible mum, so we can't be together. I've even heard them in their fear of commitment say things like, well, if I'm not going to the gym every day, there's no point in me going. They can have very black and white views to the way they lead their lives and also the way in which they approach certain things, which involve a level of commitment. And when they're not hitting things in a particular way where it conforms to their perfectionist standards, they can cause a lot of shame and also feelings of, just not wanting to continue pursuing the thing because they don't feel like they're actually good enough and they're not actually matching up to what they want for that particular thing, that activity, the relationship that they're in. Can FAs be more open when they have drunk the addictive substance? They were so open when drunk. Yes, and that's also the same for dismissive avoidance. I often find people are, in general, more open with how they feel when they are drunk. And as a consequence, these individuals have a tendency to be much more open with their feelings for you when they're inebriated, but when they are sober, they often retreat back into their shell because it's too shameful for them. So like, no way, I don't want to do that again. That is not an excuse, by the way, to get your avoidant partner drunk, just so that way you can confirm if they like you or not. If they're acting with all their walls up, it's usually an indicator that you have gotten quite close to them. They don't usually just want to take that any further because they're quite scared. So please bear in mind, this is not an excuse to have a party just to find out if you actually can be together. I find myself connecting with men with FA tendencies. 2 of them were raised by alcoholic fathers. Are these connected? Yes. And I also want to add, maybe also something to think about for yourself too in reflection in therapy, but without, going and giving you a private therapy session in this live, I just want to say that FAs usually have come from chaotic family backgrounds, including parents who are alcoholics. So that is very, very common. How do I know an FA, how do I as an FA know whether the person I keep going back to is someone to stay with or not? Oh, that's actually a very hard question to answer, because the problem is when someone is in their avoidancy and also in their anxious state, often they're clouded by a lot of big emotions, lots of anxiety, lots of fears, lots of love, anger, distrust. So it can be really hard to assess, quite rationally whether or not this person is someone who could be quite safe. But generally speaking, how do you feel when you're around this person? Not just in terms of, like the extremes. I mean, realistically speaking, like if you were to write out their qualities and also their tendencies, are these people who are quite consistent? Have they ever done the things that you may accuse them of? Have they ever, given you reason to, have they ever given reason for you to believe that they aren't trustworthy? But if you really look at the evidence of them, have they shown signs of gaslighting you? Because if not, that's a good sign. Have they shown signs of being alcoholics or having impulse issues where they can't manage themselves? Because if not, again, that's really good. It's really about checking a lot of your, fears off and being like, no, actually, this person may actually be really, really good because they're consistent, they're stable, they appear sturdy, and they also seem to want to work on this with me. If they're the kind of people that tend to erupt into violence and also physical abuse, or are people that are so similar to your mother or your father, that's when I'd be questioning whether or not this is the right kind of relationship, because that might be too similar and then you're engaging in a trauma bond of a different kind. So I think it's really good to take a very objective look at the facts, and also even to ask some people that like, hey, what do you think of, this person that I'm dating? do you think that there's someone that, you know, you would date if you were attracted to them, or if you think that they are someone who is, you know, someone who you think actually has the capacity to be a good partner for me? Have that chat with a therapist, because it's good to also to have people on your side to sort of bounce back some of this information with. But please bear in mind, it's good to talk to the people who you feel safe to talk to about this sort of stuff. Well-intended friends and family can say very invalidating things about the people we choose to date. So choose your counsel wisely. I am fearful avoidant, dating a dismissive avoidant. Do you think we'll get along? Okay. It depends. There's a lot of literature which would say this is unlikely to work out. But here's the thing. Because you are someone who recognizes your style, and hopefully they do too, there is a likelihood that you can overcome each other's respective fears of intimacy, but it does require a lot of work. A lot of people who are FA who date DAs, often find it bloody excruciating and really painful to be a part of that process, because it can be really re-traumatizing. Many DAs will say you're being too needy to their FAs, which will set the FA off like an explosion, and that can cause them to feel really re-traumatized. And similarly, the FA, when they're lashing out, can mirror a lot of the chaotic behavior that the DAs have gone through in childhood. So it's not a match made in heaven by any stretch of the imagination. But once again, self-awareness, willingness to actually work on some of these trauma issues, and taking the due diligence to actually go to couples counseling or do your work, you know, respectively, can actually, you know, lead to this working together. But I can't say with absolute certainty. I don't have my attachment style horoscope to give you a guarantee that this will actually work out. So just want to share that. Anyways, let's keep going. What type of therapy would you recommend for someone who has been diagnosed as fearful avoidant with CPTSD and ADHD? I currently use CBT, which is great, but feels like it's very on the surface. Okay. Take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt, because I don't know you and also a lot of your stuff that you would, you know, you're going through, but I have to say what you've shared is pretty much bang on the money. A lot of people who are going through CBT, I often find, I've said it's way too surface level. It's also good for sort of like mindfulness adjacent activities, but it does not help your attachment related stuff. I highly, highly recommend speaking to a somatic therapist who understands internal family systems therapy, EMDR, and or dialectical behavioral therapy, because that's where you'll find the most improvements. And that also can tackle some of the ADHD related stuff as well. ADHD, I often find people benefit from medication because there is a lot of successful literature for treatment for that. So highly recommend that if that's something you're open to. But again, this is not prescriptive. This is something you can, you know, for you to figure out. But the fact that you're already feeling like it's a bit too surface level is probably a good indicator that maybe for you, it just doesn't feel right for the stage that you need to go through. CBT, I often think of is like basic maths, and a lot of the emotional somatic work is like your algebra, trigonometry, and you're getting more advanced into the level of actually working more into yourself. But it's a great place to start, so let's not discount that. Okay, going through a lot of these other ones. Excuse me. Let's see. Do FAs tend to be in poly relationships more than other attachment groups? Yes. And I'd also argue DAs would also be part of that as well too. I think FAs and DAs, in their attempts to try and protect themselves due to their fear of intimacy, are likely to enter into polyamorous relationships. People who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community, including myself, understand it well that many of us are big proponents of free love. However, many people within our community also use that as a way to manage their own internal stuff because they have a real fear of bonding with people. So on one hand, you have a lot of people who are indeed experimenting and actually having these fantastic polyamorous experiences, and then others who are using it as a way to try and create distance from their loved ones. Typically, how long does an FA detach for when triggered? Excuse me. So in terms of like how long do they detach, I find that their detachment doesn't have... Okay, some of them can be long. It can be months for some, sometimes years, but more frequently I'd argue that it actually can be days or weeks, because some of them crave you very quickly. So please bear in mind that it's not going to be the same universally for everyone. Why sex as a fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant with someone we actually love is so difficult and awkward and almost unbearable? Usually because there can be fear of, there can be performance anxiety. Again, a lot of this is anxiety based, and I know that's reductive, but usually it's also that fear of feeling like you're not good enough for your partner. It's that feeling that your partner's going to judge or shame you for your performance sexually. It can also be down to feeling like you're inadequate, that you don't look good enough. If you had a lot of shaming as a kid, over a lot of, features that you may have, then understandably that's something that you may worry that will be projected and shamed onto you too. Many people who've been shamed for their physical appearance often feel incredible performance-related anxieties when they're sleeping with people, especially those that they're closest to, because these are the people that they feel could hurt them the most. If you've ever dated someone who you really care about, I gotta tell you, the pressure's on, because that person, the way they communicate with you, the way they interact with you, can absolutely level you because of how vulnerable you both get with each other. So that's why it can be something which can cause tremendous distress for both people. My girlfriend shows FA, fearful avoidance plus dismissive avoidance. She thinks I'm too good for her. Max, mean, and criticizing when triggered, never owns up, breaks up periodically on reasons that she isn't attracted to me, but says she has grown to love me. That sounds very much like the characteristics of a disorganized or a fearful avoidant attacher. That's very textbook, what you've just described. Fearful avoidant can say, right person, wrong time. I think dismissives and fearfuls both would say that, so... Yes, and it can be part of, again, their rationalization. If anyone's looking for rationalizations that I did, that was a few weeks ago where I talked about all the kinds of avoidant rationalizations that you may hear. So that's definitely one of them. Last year left me thinking that he didn't deserve me or our life. Came back saying he wanted everything and why didn't he deserve... And why he... I'm presuming it's why he didn't deserve me. Now left saying we shouldn't have conflict and don't get on. Okay, that sounds like someone who's very conflict averse and also someone with very low self-worth. I can't tell if that's necessarily someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style, but what I'd argue more than anything else is it does seem to me like this is someone who obviously is quite triggered by closeness and also doesn't feel very good enough to be with someone like yourself, which can be sad. I think I may have mentioned this because I noticed one of the individuals here made a comment here saying, he told me I've been mean to you. I don't love myself and don't deserve the things you do. I may not have mentioned this, but FAs tend to be meaner than DAs. I think I might have mentioned this in the beginning about how DAs tend to be colder than FAs, but just to reiterate, FAs tend to be much more passive-aggressive than DAs, and as a consequence, they can wear their partner down when they're feeling like their partner's getting too close to them. So there is a tendency for that to play out. Why do the FAs always reach out frequently to check you after the breakup? Do they really care about the ex-partner or are they in need of an ego boost? Maybe both. I don't think it's really a case of being like, oh, my partner misses me, I feel so powerful over them. It's usually more of sometimes I feel like more coming from a place of despair in that they still want to, have interaction with you, but they can also be quite ashamed of how they left, also feeling guilty. And I find that for a lot of them, it's really a case where, they do want you to reach out, but they'd be loath to admit that they actually want you. So it's one of those things where if they're reaching out frequently after the breakup, there can be multiple reasons as to why they do it. I know some DAs do that because they want to make sure that they didn't hurt their partner too much after leaving, after abruptly ending things. But FAs often may come back around because they're more actually interested in still having access to you, and they may also want to return things to the way they were under a new label like friendship. So... And DAs do the friendship thing too. It's not exclusive to one or the other in that one. By a survivor, I mean of receiving FA stuff, not me being an FA. I'm anxiously touched, just for the record. I guess this is a good opportunity to say people who experience fearful avoidancy won't always be anxious attachers. And I really want to reiterate for everyone here that being with someone who has a fear of intimacy and fear of commitment is likely going to trigger the shit out of most people, where they will develop more anxious related symptoms synonymous with anxious attachment. I know a lot of avoidants, believe it or not, who've gotten with people who are more avoidant than them, and it has triggered the heck out of that more anxious side of them, something that they've never felt before. So please bear in mind, the individuals you date can have a profound impact on your nervous system and your sense of well-being because of the way in which that person's trauma is playing out. I see way too many influencers making the erroneous assumptions that if if you've dated an avoidant, therefore you must be anxious or emotionally unavailable. Not always true. It can very much be down to ignorance at times, or just simply being in a case where you didn't know any better because of your own history, whatever it may be. And there's a whole bunch of different factors that go into this. It's never usually black and white. There are obviously a few traits and things where we're like, oh, yep, if you had this experience, you're more likely to be with that person. But again, it's never usually just one and done, clear cut, this is how it is. Still very much an evolving art that we're trying to figure out here. BPD versus fearful avoidance. What's the main difference? One's a personality disorder, the other one is an attachment style. So I'm going to do my best to try and describe borderline personality disorder, which I'm not a major expert on, so take this with a grain of salt. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by instability, particularly around emotional state, and also is characterized by a lot of despair. So what I mean by that is it's someone who typically, and this is like this is more the overt BPD, not the quiet BPD. This is someone who has patterns of behavior that include but are not limited to extreme suicidal ideation and a likelihood to act on that. People who have an extreme fear of abandonment. People who feel an emotion much more than the average person, where their mood swings are way more frequent than the average human being. These are people who aren't really able to hold on to a job very well, who don't have really good regulation skills, who do fortunately have an excellent clinically approved treatment plan that's available thanks to dialectical behavioral therapy, that it's been proven to be very effective for people who experience BPD. These are people who really struggle with a lot of their interpersonal relationships. Sometimes erroneously, a lot of people believe that people with BPD are exclusively anxious attachers. And whilst that's definitely more characterized of the overt BPD crowd, not exclusively. The quiet BPDs are more your dismissive avoidance, but they hide a lot of the instability, and they may shut down, oddly enough, more frequently than an average dismissive avoidant. So that sort of stuff is like chaos intensified times 10, but it just shows up in different ways. Fearful avoidant attachment is just a relational attachment disorder, or not disorder, but it's a relational attachment related issue formed from childhood. And that's something where BPD is, that is highly influenced by traumatic events and sometimes can be down to traumatic related events. But for the people who have fearful avoidancy, their moodiness may look and seem like BPD, but it's usually characterized by more of mistrust around being with someone. And so the hyper moodiness of someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style in a relationship may be exclusive, but not something which limits them from being able to hold down a job, from someone who's able to, these people may not have like high suicidal ideation, for example. These individuals may not have a lot of the other traits that someone with borderline personality disorder have, but it may seem like a more mild version of that experience. So just want to throw that out there and say that's my basic summary of the differences. What does a healed fearful avoidant look like? Do they continue to have these fears or want to deactivate? From what I understand, based on some of my colleagues who actually have a fearful avoidant attachment style now gone secure, is I find there is a tendency for them to feel like they're much more secure, and often they tend to have a lot more open trust with the people that are around them. And there is a tendency for them to also show a lot of those strong signs of security in their relationships. I do tend to see a lot of them also tend to date partners who they feel like there's a sense of control or superiority over, just to make them feel safe. But for the most part, some of these dynamics work really well for them, and they actually get along really, really well in terms of navigating their lives thereafter. For them, I've got to say, a lot of them can actually have very, very healthy relationships where they're able to navigate conflict and also issues very well, and they're able to pull out of their avoidancy and also a lot of their fear of abandonment quite quickly as they start to regulate and notice their triggers. They're just much better at communicating in general. So this definitely isn't a death sentence by any stretch of the imagination, but again, boils down to self-awareness and willingness to work on it. Let's see. How can a fearful avoidant be too triggered to be with you but easily be with a new partner because you are someone they feel incredibly vulnerable with, and that scares the shit out of them that you might do something that could hurt them? So in that context, going to someone new who doesn't have the same capacity to trigger them is someone who it makes them feel incredibly safe to be with. So just to bear in mind, I know it can seem quite insulting, but the reality is that here's the sick irony. The closer you get with a lot of these people, the higher their walls will usually go up, especially romantically. Close friends are no exception to this rule. A lot of FAs and DAs don't usually have very close friends and often perpetually wonder why people would ever want to hang out with them because of their feelings of low self-worth. So please bear in mind too that for many avoidant attachers, they often try and keep their friends at arm's length, which is often why they don't usually have very deep friends, and those that they do have tend to be pushed away, or they find deactivating strategies for them too. So this is not exclusive to romantic relationships. Is it possible to have traits of both fearful avoidance and dismissive avoidance? Yes, and I have started to notice this with a few people where there seems to be a bit of a blend and a blur. So I've not yet met someone who I'd say has both of these, but I think the closest I would identify with this is sometimes I find dismissive avoidance will sometimes more frequently return to their former partner and exhibit extreme patterns of anxious behavior, which is quite odd. And what I mean by that is the sense that it's almost so jarring compared to how cold and aloof they were, particularly when they may have abruptly ended things with you. So please bear in mind that if a standard dismissive avoidant is someone who's usually one and done and may not look back, they might be overlapping into more of disorganized territory if they're starting to come back on a more frequent basis and also starting to be more hot and cold with their partner that they're dating. But this is not necessarily indicative that they have a fearful avoidant attachment style, or in reverse, that someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style is more likely to be a bit of a dismissive avoidant. A lot of this is shaped by childhood upbringing and a whole bunch of different things that all combine into this sort of stuff. So definitely similarities there. Let's take a look. How to respond to a dismissive avoidant, fearful avoidant that is trying to re-engage. Ooh, good question. So if you're someone who is a fearful avoidant and you're trying to re-engage with a dismissive avoidant, I'd still provide the same sort of logic that I would to anyone who, regardless of attachment style, is that I would definitely say, let them be. If you want to reach out to them at one point down the road, I'd say give it a few months' time. Also at a point where you're also feeling much more at ease in your nervous system as well too. So that way, if they refuse to re-engage, it's not going to hit you as hard. It also guarantees that they probably had more time to just work out of that state of detachment and state of deactivation from their shutdown. So I would say definitely work on rebuilding yourself and also working through emotional well-being. Hopefully they reach out to you before you have to reach out to them. But I would highly recommend a period of no contact because I think that does a lot of wonders for healing. And honestly, I'm not trying to enable this and also to say, oh, go and chase your ex. But often I find a lot of people do benefit from actually doing another reach out, because if that person doesn't respond favorably in the future, it might actually make you realize there's no point in actually returning to this. I know many people with a fearful avoidant attachment style who, funnily enough, were working on themselves, may have bumped into their dismissive avoidant partner again and tried working things out and having a very down-to-earth conversation. And it was really great for both of them to actually sit down and hash it out. But often, I would say, more often than not, the dismissive avoidant had a shutdown again, and they just couldn't, they couldn't unfortunately commit to a lot of the promises they may have set out initially off the back of, having that very vulnerable chat. Doesn't always happen like that, but the point simply is to say that a lot of the stuff that we would, provide people who are going through this regardless of attachment style would still work for someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style. But just bear in mind that you'd want to make sure that, like I said, you're feeling more secure inside of yourself, because the tendency to also try and, win them back over, to try and fix things, can be quite high for fearful avoidance. Very similar to anxious attachers. You two have a very similar sort of disposition to want them back again and to try and work on things. when it could very well be a case of it's over. But case by case, can't guarantee how it's going to play out. Someone just wanted to know if this is going to be posted for replay. Absolutely. So no fears of that. I'd love to know how to assess if it is worth taking a fearful avoidant back. I find that a heartfelt apology showing insights is the only way. What do you think? Okay. What I'm about to share is how I would say is a good apology, and it's something that not everyone is going to do. So a good apology would be to go, okay, I just want to start out with by saying, I'm really sorry for, how I behaved. I'm really sorry for how passive-aggressive I was behaving towards you. I know where it was coming from. And I know that whilst I have a lot of fears of getting close to people because I worry that they're going to leave me, I have to take ownership for it because it's not an excuse for how my behavior impacted you. And I could just see how I was destroying someone I really care and love in the process. And I have been going to therapy to work on this because I actually care too much about you to try, to lose you. And that's why I really, really want to work on this with you. If that's something you're open to, I acknowledge that this is something that you may not want to work on with me. And that being said, I just wanted to at least ask if this is something you're open to, because I really want to try and make this work. That's how I'd say it, generally speaking. That would need to be followed by a lot of consistent effort and also approaching this dynamic very differently, going slower, maybe just being friends to begin with, just really getting that basis of security, consistency, connection, just so that way, particularly for the FA who's going through this, they actually feel like, okay, I can trust this person. They're not going to leave me. It's okay. Everything's fine. And I think for you, you don't have to have them back if you don't want to. It's entirely case by case. Everyone's got something on the line here, and it's important to understand, whether or not this is something you want to entertain, especially if it's shown a habit of doing the same thing over and over again. I have gotten to a stage where I just don't have it in me to put up with that kind of behavior over and over and over again, to the point where I'm just like, look, 3 strikes, you're out. I can't do this alone. I really need someone who's in it to work with me. That's why, even though people, especially online, can give you these amazing tips for how to achieve secure attachment, none of this will matter if neither of you are working on this together and also willing to come together as a couple. And in a lot of cases, it can work, and in many others, it can't, because, again, there's that lack of willingness. Self-awareness is not enough for this. What is a scenario where fearful avoidance can trust you? I can't really paint one, but I think, generally speaking, a fearful avoidant attacher, depending on their history, is more likely to trust if they've had consistency around you, they feel safe that you are someone who's relatively predictable, you are someone who they feel like it's a very controlled sort of environment where they feel like, okay, I know what I'm getting myself into, and they also feel like they're getting a lot of support from a team who are their therapeutic support team. They've got friends who are around them who can actually validate and also give them a sense of security with what they're doing. So highly, highly recommend for people who are in this space to really re-examine a lot of their existing relationships, the people that are supporting them, to make sure it helps them feel more in line with their intuition and also to create a sense of safety for them too. Let's see. What are the odds of a fearful avoidant reaching out after dumping someone? Note that she knows she is an avoidant. I'd argue a fearful avoidant's more high than a dismissive avoidant based on my experience, but please don't take my word as gospel. Only because they have a much more overt fear of abandonment and also are more likely to try and chase you off the back of it. A lot of avoidants suffer from what I call the phantom X, not my phrase. It's a commonly used phrase to describe that feeling of longing, loss, and nostalgia and love for a former flame. So a lot of avoidant attachers are likely to bounce back. My avoidant ex has traits of both fearful avoidance and dismissive avoidance. Is that even possible, or do people really only fit into one box? No, it's pretty blurry. Honestly, it can be... There's a really good... what's it called? There's a really good illustration for this that I posted yesterday on my story, where it was really just to show how it's very blurred, but without going over and showing that particular graph again, the point simply is to say that, it's not usually just such a neat box. But I'd say one style probably is more overt than the other. And I do find that FAs and DAs can actually have quite distinctive differences between the two of them. Let's see here. FA is more narcissistic and abusive in relationships. Oh, okay. I'm going to say I don't know. There's a lot of literature out there that suggests that avoidants in general lean more narcissistic than, say, anxious attachers. But if anyone watches Dr. Ramani, her videos would argue that more anxiously attached people lean more narcissistic. So without really having a proper survey, studies, and also time to really assess how these studies were performed, it's really one of those things where people who are high on the narcissistic traits are really trying to protect themselves, obviously, and there's a lot of lack of self-awareness and a lot of grandiosity, and sometimes there's obviously the covert stuff too. But I'd say, generally speaking, people are probably, there is a high likelihood of narcissistic traits with high levels of insecure attachment. But I can't say like a definitive answer and be like, one's more narcissistic than the other. I think it really is a case-by-case basis. So apologies for a very vague answer. What if this person comes back 8 times? I've let them come back because I'm in a friends with benefits world. What's it meaning? They just really like coming back to you. I mean, I don't think there's really much more to say. If a fearful avoidance coming back and forth, I mean, it is what it is. You can decide how you want to handle that. Can a fearful avoidant self-reflect on how they've treated exes? Absolutely. There's a really great user on TikTok. I don't know her full username. She goes by the name of Tash. She's a self-assessed and diagnosed fearful avoidant. It's not a diagnosis, but just use that word for what it's worth. And she has phenomenal content, and she's very, very, very self-aware of how she's behaved with previous partners, including her most recent one. So yes, in fact, I'd argue fearful avoidants are way more self-aware on average than the dismissive avoidants. Any success stories with fearful avoidant exes coming back? Yeah, there's actually a lot. There's a lot of fearful avoidants who can make it work, who have come back to their exes. So absolutely. I can't name any off the top of my head. Let's see. I think that is pretty much it from that. So I'm going to just quickly go through some of these other ones. Probably have a disorganized attachment style. How do I heal? I want a secure relationship. I keep attracting narcissistic partners and been dating a fearful avoidant who suddenly cut contact. Okay, so I'm assuming you're someone who has a disorganized attachment style. I'm going to really summarize and condense the answer I gave earlier when someone asked this question. Firstly, growing your self-awareness, learning your triggers, learning your thoughts and processes around when you start to get activated into your fear of abandonment and fear of intimacy, being able to work with a somatic therapist, someone who specializes in internal family systems therapy or IFS, going through EMDR, and or also doing dialectical behavioral therapy. If you've had a history of dating narcissistic partners, there is a high likelihood that you've also grown up with a narcissistic parent or had narcissistic people in your life. So there is a tendency for you perhaps to have more, to lean more towards dating those kind of people because it's familiar and the red flags don't show up as readily because it's something that you're used to. And you've been dating a fearful avoidant who suddenly cut contact. That's pretty brutal to go through, and I'm sorry that you're going through that. How does a fearful avoidant without self-awareness look? Nightmare. Not in the sense that they are a nightmare, but the situation is a nightmare. Because if you are dating a fearful avoidant who's constantly doing the whole thing of like, I hate you, but don't leave me, it can be maddening on the recipient. To people who also to a lot of people who've grown up as being high achievers, who constantly learnt as a child to strive for academic success, for instance, in order to receive love from a caregiver, they are particularly vulnerable to dating avoidant attachers, particularly fearful avoidance, because it can trip up people and make them feel like, I need to win this person over. How do I get them back again? And as a consequence, it can make someone lose a lot of rational thought in the process. And it's a really nasty place to get to because you're getting so much intermittent reinforcement from someone who's constantly coming back and forth. So it's pretty hard. And it can also erode your self-esteem too, because fearful avoidance, I mean, being with a dismissive avoidant who's self-aware will also do that to you, but being with someone who's a fearful avoidant who lacks self-awareness, because they're often quite mean and passive-aggressive, can make you feel like you're the problem when they're projecting a lot of their stuff onto you. Let's see. Okay, the dating sites need to come out with a secure attacher certification badge. Okay, on one hand, yes, and I mean, it's partially funny, but I'm going to say something that's a bit controversial. You can still date avoidance. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, and a lot of people don't want to, and I really respect that. But not every avoidant attacher is like your ex. There are going to be some who are quite self-aware and willing to work on themselves and may have actually had a history of being in therapy and working on their attachment style. That is definitely a green flag. And it also comes with the knowledge, hopefully, that they're actually quite aware of their triggers. Many people don't have that knowledge and awareness, so please bear in mind that someone's attachment style isn't necessarily a pronouncement of how this relationship will go, but I just want to say, please, 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 don't let that be something that turns you off. I, myself, am someone who has a limited tolerance for hot and cold behavior because I'm over it, and I'm just like, I don't have the time or bandwidth for it. But that's not going to be everyone. Some people will be able to make it work, because their disposition, their relational style, their emotional availability. There might just be a whole number of factors that just make it work. But at the end of the day, your mental and emotional well-being, your standards, your values, your non-negotiables matter. So don't drop that just because, you want to be in a relationship. And certainly, if you're looking to be with someone who's more secure, that's certainly okay. But just remember too, that it doesn't necessarily have to take someone who's exclusively secure to make a secure relationship. Okay, let's see. There are avoidants who don't even want to go to therapy and thinks that they don't need therapy. It's so difficult to have relationships with them. How do we encourage them to do so? By not encouraging them. Often the best thing to do in these kind of cases is just to leave them be. This is a great example of the category of people who I'm probably like, yeah, don't date these people. I know it's harsh and I know it's really hard, but unless that person is willing to actually take accountability and responsibility for themselves, I mean, it's really a dead end in a lot of cases. And that is the hard reality in that kind of case, because it's just kind of like, okay, I can't move mountains on my own. Now, that being said, if you are okay with that avoidant attacher as they are, that's fantastic. Don't force them to go to therapy if you like them as they are. But if their defense mechanisms are getting in the way of a relationship where you want more out of that, like more depth, more intimacy, that's a very reasonable thing to be considering and also reflecting on, because you don't need to stay if it doesn't feel right to you. What does it mean to have a disorganized attachment style? In a nutshell, you basically have a conscious fear of abandonment, a conscious fear of intimacy, and it's defined by a lot of mistrust, where you often have had bad experiences with very inconsistent and also maybe very abusive parents and also abusive partners, where you struggle to feel safe in even secure relationships because you always worry that you're going to be dating someone who may be an abuser or repeat the drama that you had in childhood. So you may try and find ways to destroy this person because you don't feel like you can trust them and you fear that they might hurt you. And so as a way of defending yourself, you constantly try and tear this apart. So that's my very short summary of that. Since deactivation happens on a subconscious level, do avoidants really believe they truly love their rebounds? Ooh. I can't confidently answer that question. Okay. Love is a funny thing, because as one of my colleagues who has an avoidant attachment described so eloquently, he would say, I was falling in love with some of these people and I didn't allow myself to fall too deeply with some of these individuals. And I think this perfectly illustrates how some of these individuals like to keep one foot out the door just to manage a lot of their own emotional experiences with this. So what I mean by that is to say, I think they definitely care and love a lot of the people that they date, generally speaking. But is it a deep love? depends from case to case. I think that with the people who are their rebounds, however, I would argue that it really depends on what they're getting out of them. Some of these people they may just be physically attracted to and they're just getting sex because it makes them just distract themselves with a lot of the intensity that they're feeling. Others may be so emotionally unavailable that it feels safe because it helps them to just not be triggered by their fear of intimacy. Others may be complete abusers where they go into a very, trauma-bonded mess. And you know what? Many people still love their abusers, but it may not be a very deep love because it's characterized by a lot of the classic ups, downs, love bombing, devaluing, and discarding. I know that's specifically a narcissistic cycle. But the point is that, love is a very subjective experience. And I think that, some people will say, well, real love is when you're absolutely connected with your partner and you're engaging in intimacy and it's not hot and cold, blah, blah, blah. And then others will say, no, I just generally felt strong feelings for them and I'd characterize that as love. I'd argue that, my personal preference is we don't need to be pretentious about love, but, I find avoidants typically are more rigid about what they define love as, and it can often be denial because they don't want to admit the fact that they actually, got too close to someone from time to time. Ken, could you interview someone who has healed their insecure attachment style to earn secure? I'd love to. I haven't done that yet. Actually, that may not necessarily be true. That's a lie. One of my very, 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 very old interviews I did many moons ago with a coach who's on this platform called Valerie Adams. She identifies with fearful avoidance. She and her partner have been going strong for quite a while. And we were talking more about identifying healthy versus toxic relationships in our live. That was 2 years ago. You can find it if you just scroll through the masses of my videos. But she's got some really good stuff and she focuses more on business coaching now rather than dating coaching. But I would argue she's an example of someone who's gone to earn secure. But I'm definitely open to doing more interviews with people who have got a more earn secure attachment style off the back of their, attachment stuff. I don't typically work with people who are more on the severe side of avoidancy because I focus more on what I call small t trauma in CPTSD. A conversation for another time. But my colleagues usually are the ones who engage more with people who want to heal from their avoidant attachment at the severe end. I still have my avoidant clients, but it's just one of those things where it's to say, it's something that I would love to actually interview someone on because I think it's just such a fantastic thing to hear. And it's a beautiful story when I've heard about it. We were friends for a couple of months. He was married in the past. We ended up having sex, but after that, he just stopped talking to me. Is this because of fearful avoidance? No, I'd argue that's more because of dismissive avoidance. If it was someone with more fearful avoidance, I feel like that would be characterized also by a lot more you would be characterized by a lot of hot and cold behavior, passive aggressiveness, a lot of excessive nitpicking, and then, maybe leaving you, coming back, redefining the relationship, saying they miss you and love you, leaving the relationship again. That doesn't really give me the vibe of someone who's just exclusively a fearful avoidant on that information alone. So take my word with a grain of salt. Where is it also why? Okay, let me just go over this. My fearful avoidant ex told me, I just don't see this going the distance, so I don't want to waste your time. I'm only laughing because it's such a classic rationalization they often have when he abruptly broke up. We have hooked up a few times in the 6 or so months after breakup. Why? I'm assuming why does he continue to hook up with you post-breakup? Because he may still want access to you because he's still emotionally connected to you, but doesn't want to have the relationship. A lot of these people are scared of being committed with someone. And so as a consequence, being friends with benefits is, something that helps them feel safe. A lot of this is done to manage and protect themselves, even though it has disastrous impacts on their partners like yourself. So I am sorry that you're going through that. Let's see. My fearful avoidant has unfortunately blindsided me and offered me friendship, which I had declined. Well done. I haven't spoken to her for 2 months, and I'm not sure if we could work through it. She made up a fight and broke up. That actually is a huge thing that happens with fearful avoidance, unlike dismissive avoidance. I often find fearful avoidance are more prone to starting fights, and also, like I said earlier in this live, prone to, using psychotherapeutic jargon to justify their exit as well. So it can be quite hard on the person who's just come off the back of that. So it's really, really, really nasty to be on the receiving end. Okay, now I'm just going to see if there's any more questions in here. And then I'm going to call it a night for me because your boy wants to go to bed. Okay, what is the likelihood of a fearful avoidant returning after an extremely loving relationship but also had an extremely bad ending? How long after no contact do they return? I can't guarantee. I mean, typically I find for dismissive avoidance, it's anywhere between 5 to 6 months or sometimes a couple of years. But for a fearful avoidant returning, I'd say that likelihood is higher, but I'm not going to put a number on it. I think, if they had time to sort of reflect on it and also dated other people where they felt like, yeah, these people weren't safe, and then they reflected on you quite fondly, there is a high likelihood that they may return down the line. So that could happen. I want to support my fearful avoidant ex who wanted to break up 6 months ago by stating that they're scared. Should I wait for them to gain self-awareness or volunteer to work on themselves? Does it also work to let them know we are here to support them, or do we understand their fears? Neither. I know it's going to sound strange, but they don't often want your help or also want you to show that you support them. That is like trying to tell someone who's in the closet that they're, it's safe to come out and, identify yourself as part of the LGBTQI plus community. A lot of the time they're going to be like, that does not feel safe. That feels like an invitation to not do that. So we're going to resist every urge to try and go in that direction. I know it sounds, like it's a bit oxymoronic, but these people really need to discover this in their own time. And so I know it can be really painful when you want to help them, and also if you still want to be with them. I'm not going to shame anyone who still wants to be with their partner if they broke up with them, because I was in that stage many moons ago. These individuals gave us often the best love of our lives, and I'm not going to take that away from anyone who wants that back again. But I really think it's a case that they just need to be left to their own devices, and they need to just, choose to seek therapeutic support if they want it. Let's see. I'm going to do one more, and then... Actually, I'll do two more, and then I'll end up... This is not part of the two. But how often do I do these Q&A lives? Whenever I feel like it. At this rate, I've done about one a week, but I'm probably going to reduce that and just spontaneously be like, hello, I'm going to do a Q&A. Can fearful avoidance also be anxiously attached if a partner abruptly disconnects with them or walks away from them? Absolutely they can. In fact, fearful avoidance often enter into a huge period of, severe anxious attachment if a partner leaves them, especially if that partner was avoidance, as in dismissive avoidance. So, absolute yes to that question. Okay, last question. Great last question, by the way. Why is commitment hard for a fearful avoidant or dismissive avoidant? They talk about becoming boyfriend and girlfriend was always hard. Because that causes them to that causes them severe anxiety and also a whole bunch of other things to happen. So commitment to someone with an avoidant attachment style just in general is like a death sentence for a lot of them. They feel like, oh God, I'm going to lose my independence. I am going to lose my sense of self. Often their brain can have like a defensive reflex where it just shuts them down and they're like, I can't be here, I need to leave. And so they'll find a way to just exit their relationship because being close to someone can feel very unsafe. If these people grew up with, say, a overly controlling enmeshed parent, they do not want to re-go through that trauma. So they often feel like the best thing to do is to push the partner away because they fear losing themselves like they did when they were with one of their parents who was like all on top of them. And by on top of them, I don't mean just physically. I mean mostly emotionally, having very emotionally incestuous parents. The other thing to also bear in mind too is that for a lot of people with avoidant attachment, they have a lot of what I call quiet anxiety where you don't see it. They internalize a lot of their anxiety and it's quite severe. And for them, the thought of being in a relationship also causes them to feel tremendous amounts of low self-worth because they feel like this person that I'm seeing is probably going to think that I'm terrible. I'm so scared that they see a side of me that they don't like and they'll reject me. So they often try and find a way to, escape a relationship to protect themselves. So it's not, so for example, a lot of us might look at commitment and think, no, it's not a big deal. It is what it is. But for these individuals, it's really frightening because it's more than just like, being in a long-term relationship. For them, it feels like such a loss of self, loss of freedom, loss of security, loss of safety. And it can also mean that in their exit, as I talk about all the time, it can have such a huge impact on their partner as well too. So all that to say is it's pretty brutal for the people who go through this. Anyways, thank you everyone for joining me for this fun little live on fearful avoidancy. Just to round out before I finish, like I've said a few times, these lives are not going to be held here forever. I'm looking to find a way to turn this into more of a community experience for people who want the education and want the information on this sort of stuff. I love doing these lives. They're a lot of fun. And I love the questions and answers that I get to do as part of this too. So thank you very much for coming as always. And this will be part of like a paid community that I do eventually. So enjoy the free content. But other than that though, I hope everyone got some value on this. And I'm thinking I'll do some content soon live on how to heal from avoidant attachment, because I haven't really done too much of that before. And I might also find the opportunity to do some other things related to dismissive avoidance and also trends with attachment styles, meaning like how it shows up in the LGBT community between heterosexual men and heterosexual women, and a whole bunch of other adjacent sort of stuff too where relevant, because I'm really enjoying giving this information out. So anyways, thank you very much. Have a wonderful end to your week, everyone. And for those of us going into our weekends, I hope you enjoy your weekend. And I'll catch everyone around again sometime soon.